Hi everybody, salam. Welcome back to my channel. So we have a new lesson which is about the direct object maker raw. I also refer to this as the article raw. So I know this lesson is too long, and the reason is that this grammar topic is so important in the Persian grammar that there was no way for me to make the lesson shorter. And I really wanted you guys to really understand this lesson, and I wanted to include all the nuances and all the points that comes with this grammar topic. But I can promise you by the end of this lesson, you will become an expert on the article raw. Now let's start with the lesson, but before that, if you have not subscribed to my channel yet, please don't forget to do so because your likes and comments and subscriptions really motivate me to make more videos for you guys. Before we start this lesson, just wanted to let you know that this video has two parts. This is part one. Once you are finished watching part one, make sure you also check out part two because they are related. In the previous lesson, we learned about prepositional verbs in Persian. If you have not watched that lesson yet, make sure you watch it because then you will understand this lesson better. So in this lesson, we are going to cover a lot. First, I'm going to give you a brief explanation about transitive verbs and then the three kind of objects. And then we are going to learn about the article raw. And then we are going to take a look at 10 examples. And then on the important points, we will go over some points that are related to this grammar topic. Before we start learning about the article raw, there are two important grammar topics that you need to know in order to understand this lesson. The first one, you need to know what transitive and intransitive verbs are, and the second one are the three kinds of objects: direct object, indirect object, and object of prepositions. In the next two slides, I have given a brief explanations about them. If you don't know what these topics are, make sure you first watch these two slides, and then we're going to move on to the article raw. What we are going to learn in this lesson about the article raw only applies to transitive verbs. If you don't know what transitive and intransitive verbs are, let me just give you a very quick explanation here. So transitive verbs are verbs that need to have a direct object. For example, I bought an apple. If I just say I bought without mentioning an apple, then the sentence would be incomplete. That's why a direct object is needed when it comes to a transitive verb, and the action of the verb, in this case to buy, goes to the object. But on the right side, intransitive verbs are verbs that they do not need to have an object, and the action of the verb exerts on the subject. For example, I slept or we danced. So we do not need to have objects here, and these two sentences are still complete. And the action of, for example, sleeping goes back to the subject, or to dance goes to the subject. So again, in this lesson, we are only going to deal with transitive verbs. Now we also need to learn about the three kinds of objects because they are important for this lesson. I'm going to explain it by using this example here. So I gave her a book. So here the noun a book is the direct object because it is the noun receiving the action and it answers the question of what or whom. But in this example, it answers the question of what. So I gave, what did you give? A book. So this is our direct object. And then we have her here. Her is the indirect object because it is the noun that receives the direct object and it depends on the direct object. And then usually it answers the question of to / for what or for whom. But if you remember in the previous lesson about prepositional verbs in Persian, I mentioned that in Persian we need to have a preposition for the indirect object. But in English, there's no preposition, but in Persian, we need to have a preposition. So I gave her a book because there's no preposition between the verb and the indirect object. So in Persian, we need to rephrase that and we need to have a preposition. So we need to say something like, I gave a book to her. So now the direct object stays the same, but now this, because the indirect object now has a preposition, so the name changes to object of preposition. Let's do the sentence in Farsi. So چیزی به کسی دادن. So the verb دادن is to give. چیزی is something, which is a book, which is our direct object. And then کسی is someone, which is the object of preposition. من یک کتاب به او دادم. So یک کتاب is the direct object, and then او is the object of preposition. So in Persian, we only deal with direct objects and objects of prepositions. We do not have indirect objects. Specific direct object and the article ra in Persian. So let's see what we mean by this title here. I'm going to use this example. The sentence here says, I read a book, which the translation is Man yek kitab khondam. By asking the question what, we know book is a direct object, but it is an indefinite direct object because of the indefinite article a. And also in Farsi, the indefinite article yek is in a bracket because we have said in lesson 2 that it's not very strict. So I can say man kitab khondam, and it is still implying an indefinite direct object. Now let's shift a little bit to the right and let's take a look at this column. Now, if you look at the sentences here in this column, you will notice that the direct objects are no longer indefinite, but they are all specific because of the modifiers before them. For example, here, I read my book. So this is a specific direct object because I'm referring to my book. Or for example, here, I read this book. So I'm pointing out to a specific book and I'm saying I read this book. So when this happens in Persian, it will trigger the article ra, which follows the direct object. So now if you look at this column here, these are the translations. But these translations are not quite correct yet, or they're not complete yet. What this translation are missing are the article ra. So I'm going to now go ahead and add the article ra for each one. So now these sentences are correct and they are complete. So this is what we mean, what I mean when I say that when the direct object is specific, it is going to trigger the article ra. Now let's go through each one of the sentences one by one and I will give you more explanations. Let's take a look at the first one. So here is the same example. I read a book, and here is the Farsi translation. Man yek kitab khondam. And we said in the previous slide that a book is the indefinite direct object. But now, what if I want to say I read the book? Now I'm referring to a specific book. So now the direct object is definite. Then in this situation, we need to have ra after the direct object. So man kitab ra khondam. By adding ra to the direct object, then we are referring to a specific or to a definite direct object. The second thing is when the direct object is qualified by a determiner, and this is what we mean by determiners. So back to this example, I read a book. What if now I want to say I read this book? So now the direct object has become specific because we are referring to a specific book. I'm pointing out to a book and I'm saying I read this book. So in this situation, the determiner this is going to trigger ra when translating the sentence. So man in kitab ra khondam. So the indefinite article yek has become in, and then in is going to trigger ra. But in this example, you don't see any ra here because the direct object is indefinite. It's not specific. But what if now I want to say I read this? So I don't want to repeat the noun book anymore. I just want to say I read this. Do you think it will still trigger ra? Yes, it will still trigger ra. Man in ra khondam. Because even though we are not repeating the noun kitab, but still it is still part of in. The determiner in is now part of the direct object and it's specific, so it will still trigger ra. In the previous slide, we used this, the determiner this for an example, but now let's go ahead and use the other determiners too. So I read that book. من آن کتاب را خواندم. I read these books. من این کتاب‌ها را خواندم. I read those books. من آن کتاب‌ها را خواندم. And if you're wondering how to come up with these two sentences, we have already learned that in the lesson about demonstrative pronouns and adjectives. And also, if we don't want to repeat the direct object ketab specifically anymore, then still it will trigger ra. So if I want to say I read this, man in ra خواندم. So we still need to have ra. I read that, man on ra خواندم. I read these, man اینها را خواندم. I read those, man آنها را خواندم. The next thing that will trigger ra is when the direct object is a pronoun, and this is what we mean by pronouns. Back to the same example, I read a book now becomes I read it. So here we have a direct object pronoun. And remember, the pronoun it in Farsi is on. On also means the determiner that. So now let's translate the sentence. من آن را خواندم. So on replaces یک کتاب, but it's going to trigger را. Let's take a look at another example for when the direct object is a pronoun. So here on the left side, we have a sentence. It says, I saw a girl. من یک دختر دیدم. So here the direct object is indefinite. We just saw a girl. We don't know who the girl is, right? But what if I want to say I saw her? So now her, the direct object pronoun her, replaced a girl. So now we are referring to someone specific, someone that we already know. So it will trigger ra. And then her, the direct object pronoun her in Farsi is just او. من او را دیدم. So او here is replacing یک دختر, but then because now it's specific, it's going to trigger ra. Another thing that will trigger ra is when the direct object is qualified by a possessive adjective, and this is what we mean by possessive adjectives, which we have already learned in the lesson about the possessive adjective and pronouns in Persian. Back to the book example. So I read a book. Now I want to say I read my book. So now we are referring to a specific book. In this situation, this possessive adjective my will trigger را. من کتابم را خواندم. So یک کتاب, which this one is indefinite direct object, now becomes کتابم, my book. So because it's now specific, then it will trigger را. The next thing that will trigger ra is when the direct object is a proper noun. Back to the book example. So I read a book. Now, what if I want to say I read Harry Potter? So a book now became Harry Potter. It's a proper noun. So now we are referring to a specific book. Then in this situation, the proper noun Harry Potter, it is a direct object, and because it's specific, so it will trigger را. من هری پاتر را خواندم. So یک کتاب became Harry Potter, and then Harry Potter will trigger را. Another thing that would trigger ra is when the direct object is qualified by comparative or superlative adjectives. And we have learned the comparative and superlative in Persian in one of the previous lessons. So let's go back to the same example. I read a book. Now I want to say I read the smaller book. So we have two books here in the picture, and I want to point out to the small one, and I want to say I read the smaller book. So now the direct object has become specific. So in this case, it will trigger را. من کتاب کوچکتر را خواندم. So the comparative adjective کوچکتر will trigger را. The same with superlative adjectives. So now I want to say I read the smallest book. So we have now 3 books, and then I want to point out to the small one, and I want to say I read the smallest book. So in this case, it's the same thing. The superlative adjective is going to trigger را. من کوچکترین کتاب را خواندم. So کوچکترین is the superlative adjective and is going to trigger ra because now we are pointing out to a specific book. The informal of article ra. In the spoken informal language, the pronunciation of the article ra changes a little bit. So it either becomes ro or the pronunciation becomes o. For example, I read the book. من کتاب را خواندم. But in the informal spoken language, we say من either کتاب رو خوندم or کتاب بو خوندم. Or for example, I ate this. من این را خوردم. In the informal spoken language, we say من این رو خوردم or من اینو خوردم. Or for example, I saw شیرین. من شیرین را دیدم. So it becomes من شیرین رو دیدم or من شیرین نو دیدم. Now let's go on the left side. If the direct object ends in the following letter, aleph, vav, or silent he, then ra becomes ro only. For example, I read the essay. من انشا را خواندم. So انشا, which means essay, ends in a long vowel aleph. So ra becomes ro. من انشا رو خواندم. Or next one, I ate this fruit. Fruit is میوه and میوه ends in a silent he. So من این میوه را خوردم becomes من این میوه رو خوردم. Or I saw مینو. من مینو را دیدم. So مینو ends in the letter vav. So it becomes من مینو رو دیدم. Now we are going to go over 10 examples and let's see how we can use the article ra in different examples. And also, if you need the vocab that are used in this lesson, there's a link in the description box so you can find the flashcards there. Let's start with the first example. I am cleaning a car. The verb here is to clean, which in Farsi is tamiz kardan. And you can see the present stem in the bracket. So to clean something. And something here is a car. So cheesy and then raw in a bracket, tamiz kardan. So here the direct object is a car, but this is an indefinite direct object. So it's not going to trigger raw. So literally we need to say something like I, a car, am cleaning. And also the indefinite in Farsi is not very strict. We don't even need to say I, a car. We can just say I, car, am cleaning. And car is machine. من یک ماشین تمیز می کنم. Or we don't need to say یک. We can say من ماشین تمیز می کنم. But now I want to say I am cleaning my car. So now we have a specific direct object. So literally we need to say I, my car, am cleaning. من ماشینم را تمیز می کنم. So here the possessive adjective mim is going to trigger ra. And now the informal of the sentence, we said that ماشینم را. In the informal language, either we need to say ماشینم رو or ماشینمو. So I'm going to read the sentence in informal spoken language. We don't even need to say man. So I'm going to start with ماشینمو. ماشینمو تمیز میکنم. Let's take a look at a few other things that might trigger ra for the same example. So we already did the first one, I am cleaning my car. Now, what if I want to say I am cleaning it? Then من آن را تمیز میکنم. So on, the pronoun on has replaced ماشینم را, but still it's going to trigger ra. And the informal of on ra is uno because the informal of on is un and ra becomes this letter vav or u. So uno, من uno تمیز میکنم. Next one, I am cleaning the car. Now we are referring to a specific car. So من ماشین را تمیز میکنم. Or من ماشین رو تمیز می کنم. Next one, I'm cleaning this car. So now we are pointing out to a car and we are saying this specific car. So من این ماشین را تمیز می کنم. Or من این ماشین رو تمیز می کنم. Next example. This week, my coworker and I finished the projects. So the verb here is to finish, which in Farsi is tamam kardan. And then to finish something. So something would be the projects. So the projects is the direct object. So چیزی را تمام کردن. And because we are referring to specific projects, so we need to have ra. So literally we need to say something like, this week, me and my coworker, the projects finished. Because in Farsi, we don't say my coworker and I. We need to say me and my coworker. Now let's go over the rest of the vocab. Week is hafte, and then coworker is hamkar, and project singular is proje. So we need to make it plural when translating this sentence. این هفته من و همکارم پروژه ها را تمام کردیم. So this one is now pretty clear. So here the article de equals the article ra in Farsi. And now the informal of the sentence, proje ha ra becomes proje ha ro. And then tamam in the informal spoken language is pronounced tamum. So this sentence in the informal language is, also remember the pronunciation of the conjunction va changes to. این هفته من و همکارم پروژه ها رو تموم کردیم. Now let's use the same example and see what other things can trigger ra. So we already did the first example, we finished the projects. What if now we want to say we finished them? So now we have a direct object pronoun. ما آنها را تمام کردیم. So now آنها is the direct object pronoun and it's going to trigger ra. And then in the informal spoken language, آنها becomes اونها and را becomes رو. So ما اونها رو تموم کردیم. And we said tamam becomes tamum. Next, we finished the harder projects. So here we have a comparative adjective and then we have plural noun because we are ranking a group of things, not an individual thing. So harder here, the comparative adjective harder is going to trigger را. ما پروژه های سخت‌تر را تمام کردیم. Which in the informal language becomes سخت‌تر را becomes سخت‌تر رو تمام کردیم. And next, we finish the hardest projects. Again, we are ranking a group of things. So we have superlative adjective and we have plural noun here. ما سخت‌ترین پروژه ها را تمام کردیم. So superlative adjective here is going to trigger را. And then we said that the informal of پروژه ها را becomes پروژه ها رو. So ما سخت‌ترین پروژه ها رو تموم کردیم. Now the next example, we ordered that cake in the restaurant. So the verb here is to order, which in Farsi is سفارش دادن. So to order something, and something is that cake. So now we have a specific direct object because of the determiner that. So چیزی را سفارش دادن because the determiner will trigger را. So literally we need to say something like we that cake in the restaurant ordered. And the vocab cake is just cake and the preposition in is dar, but in the spoken language it's pronounced to. And the restaurant is the same vocab, the pronunciation is a little bit different. We say restaurant. ما آن کیک را در رستوران سفارش دادیم. So the determiner that has triggered را. And now the informal of the sentence, آن becomes اون and کیک را becomes کیکو. So this sentence in the informal spoken language is pronounced also, dar also is to. So I'm not going to pronounce ما. I'm going to start with the determiner اون. اون کیکو تو رستوران سفارش دادیم. Now let's go over to the next example. I invited my friend to the party. So the verb here is to invite, which in Farsi is دعوت کردن. And then in English, to invite someone, right? So someone, which is my friend, is the direct object. So کسی را دعوت کردن. And then here, because friend, which is the direct object, has possessive adjective, so it's going to trigger را. So literally, we need to say something like, I, my friend, to the party invited. And the vocab, friend is دوست, party is mehmani, informal mehmuni. من دوستم را به مهمانی دعوت کردم. So here the possessive adjective mim will trigger را. And then the informal of the sentence, دوستم را, becomes دوستمو or دوستم رو. And then mehmani is mehmuni. So it's going to read, من دوستمو به مهمونی دعوت کردم. Let's use the same example and see what other things can trigger را here. So we already did the first one. Now I want to say I invited Mina to the party. So Mina is a proper noun. So من مینا را به مهمانی دعوت کردم, which مینا را becomes مینا رو, and مهمانی, we said it's مهمونی. So من مینا رو به مهمونی دعوت کردم. Or if I want to say I invited her to the party, so her is now a direct object pronoun, so it will trigger را. من او را به مهمانی دعوت کردم. Or in the informal spoken language, او را becomes او رو. And مهمانی becomes مهمونی. So من او رو به مهمونی دعوت کردم. Next example, that man found these keys on the street. So the verb here is to find, which in Farsi is پیدا کردن. So to find something. And these keys are something which is the direct object here. So it will be چیزی را پیدا کردن. Because of the determiner, these is going to trigger را. So literally, we need to say something like, that man these keys on the street found. And now let's go over to the vocab. Man is مرد. Key, singular, is کلید, but in the informal spoken language is pronounced کلید. And then street is خیابان, but in the spoken language is pronounced خیابون. آن مرد این کلیدها را در خیابان پیدا کرد. So the determiner in is going to trigger را. So now the informal of the sentence, آن becomes اون. کلیدها را becomes کلیدا رو. Because, let me change my pen here. So because we said the informal of کلید is کلید. And then in the informal spoken language, we drop the he and ra becomes ro. So kilidaro. And then dar is to. And khiyaban, khiyabun. So I'm going to read this sentence one more time, and I'm going to read it a little bit faster and informal. اون مرد این کلیدا رو تو خیابون پیدا کرد. Now I want to use the same example and I want to change something here. So instead of saying that man found these keys on the street, now I want to change the determiner these to the adverb some. So I want to say that man found some keys. Do you think in this situation it's still going to trigger raw? So now when we change the determiner these to the adverb some, now the direct object is indefinite. We are not referring to like specific keys and we don't know who this keys belongs to. So, but we just found, this man just found some keys on the street. So in this situation, it's not going to trigger raw. So آن مرد چند کلید در خیابان پیدا کرد. So as you can see here, there's no more raw. We don't need raw after the direct object here anymore because of the time adverb چند. So in the informal spoken language, this sentence is اون مرد چند کلید تو خیابون پیدا کرد. Next example, let's take a look at this picture here. So we have a dog here. Let's say her name is Luna, and we want to say this sentence: I'm taking Luna with me to the park. So the verb here is to take, which is بردن in Farsi, and you can see the present stem in the bracket. And remember, in Farsi, we have three different types of to take, but this is for another lesson. But for now, remember, every time you take something and you leave with it, then this verb is used, بردن. So to take something, so the direct object, something or someone would be Luna here. So چیزی را بردن. Why? Because Luna is a proper noun, so it will trigger را. So literally, we need to say something like I, Luna, with myself. In Farsi, we don't say with me. We need to say with myself. To the park I'm taking. Let's go over to the vocab. With is ba, but again, we need to say with myself. And then park is just park. من لونا را با خودم به پارک میبرم. So Luna, because it's a proper noun, so it's going to trigger ra. And the informal of Luna را becomes Luna رو. So من لونا رو با خودم به پارک میبرم. Next example, the teacher started the Persian class early. So the verb here is to start, which in Farsi is شروع کردن. And then to start something, we have a transitive verb here. And something, which is the direct object, is the Persian class. So it would be چیزی را شروع کردن because of the article ده. It makes the direct object definite. So literally, we need to say something like the teacher, the Persian class, early started. So teacher is معلم. There's a little bit stress on the letter lam, معلم. And then class is کلاس and early is زود. So we are going to start the sentence with the subject. معلم کلاس فارسی را زود شروع کرد. So this point is pretty clear. Now the informal of the sentence فارسی را becomes فارسیو. So this sentence in the informal spoken language is going to read معلم کلاس فارسی رو زود شروع کرد. Next example, my daughter is doing her homework now. So the verb here is to do, which in Farsi is انجام دادن. But you need to be careful with the verb انجام دادن because it's not as frequently used as in English. For example, in English, the verb to do is used, for example, to do your hair, to do laundry. But we don't use the verb انجام دادن in those contexts. We only use it when we are referring to like finishing a job, finishing a task, finishing a project, or in this case, a homework. So it's only used in like specific context. It's not as widely used as it is in English. All right, so here, to do something. So something, the direct object is her homework. So because we have the possessive adjective her here, so it will trigger را. So it's going to be چیزی را انجام دادن. So literally we need to say something like my daughter now her homework is doing. Let's go over to the vocab. Daughter is دختر, and then homework is تکالیف. And تکالیف in Persian, it's a plural noun. We use a plural noun to refer to homework. And then now it's either الان or حالا. دخترم الان تکالیفش را انجام می دهد. So the possessive adjective شین will trigger را. And then the informal of this sentence تکالیفش را becomes تکالیفش شو or تکالیفش رو. And also می دهد, there's like kind of like a drastic informal of this verb because let me change my pen here. So midahad, for in the informal spoken language we drop the letter he and then the letter dal becomes silent he, so it becomes mide. So I'm going to read this sentence one more time, a little bit faster and more colloquially. دخترم الان تکالیفشو انجام میده. Let's go over to the next example. Omid brought the best craft to the class. So the verb here is to bring, which in Farsi is آوردن. And then to bring something. What's something? Something is craft. But we are referring here to the best craft. So here we have a superlative adjective. So it's going to trigger ra because we are now making the direct object specific. So literally we need to say something like Omid the best craft to the class brought. Let's go over to the vocab. The best is بهترین. Craft is کار دستی. So literally کار, it means work or job. دست, it means hand. So it's like work of hand, something like this. And then class is کلاس. امید بهترین کاردستی را به کلاس آورد. So the superlative adjective بهترین will trigger را after the direct object. Now let's go over the informal of this sentence. Two things changes. کاردستی را becomes کاردستیو or کاردستی رو. And then آورد becomes آورد. So in the spoken informal language, we say آورد. So this sentence a little bit faster and in the spoken language is امید بهترین کاردستی رو به کلاس آورد. Next example, my mother is doing the dishes. So in English, the verb to do is used for this context, but in Farsi, we do not do the dishes, we wash the dishes. So we need to use the verb to wash, which in Farsi is شستن. So to wash something, what's something? Something is the dishes. So we have the article, definite article de in English. So it's going to trigger را, چیزی را شستن. Now let's go over the rest of the vocab. Mother is مادر and dishes is ظرف ها. مادرم ظرف ها را می شوید. So here before the conjugation we add the letter ye because the present stems ends in a long vowel. But in the informal spoken language, the pronunciation of this verb changes a little bit. So first let's go over to this one. This one changes ظرف ها را becomes ظرف ها رو. And then میشوید becomes میشوره. It's kind of, to ease the pronunciation, it's kind of, we add like the letter re, mishure, because it eases the pronunciation. And also the letter dal becomes silent he. So this sentence in the informal spoken language is مادرم ظرفا رو میشوره. This is a summary of list of triggers for the article ra. So take a screenshot of it or take some notes, because if you really want to master the article ra, then you will find this list very helpful. Before we finish this lesson, there are a few important points that you need to know. The first point is about using the article ra incorrectly with intransitive verbs. I have already explained about this in the beginning of the lesson. I said that the article ra only applies to intransitive verbs. Let's take a look at an example here. So the first sentence says, yesterday I was out with my friend. So here the verb is to be. And the verb to be is an intransitive verb, meaning it does not have a direct object. Therefore, it's not going to trigger ra. Let's translate this sentence. دیروز من با دوستام بیرون بودم. So sometimes students make the mistake of adding ra either to the subject, and they say something like دیروز من را با دوستم بیرون بودم, or they add it to the object of preposition and they say دیروز من با دوستم را بیرون بودم. But first, before adding ra, first you need to figure out whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. Then you need to figure out where to add ra. So here the verb to be is an intransitive verb. So therefore it does not have a direct object. So we don't need to have ra here. Let's take a look at another example. The birds are flying in the sky. So here the verb is to fly. So to fly is another transitive verb because the action of flying stays with the subject, the birds. So there's no direct object here. پرنده ها در آسمان, which means sky, پرواز می کنند. So here we cannot add ra to the subject because this is the subject. And then we cannot also add it to the object of preposition because again, it's not the direct object. Why? Because this verb, پرواز کردن, is an intransitive verb and it does not even have a direct object. So this is a point that you need to pay attention to. The next point, which is also a very common mistake that students make, is that they use the article ra, or they put or they give the article ra after the object of preposition. Let's see what we mean here. For example, to invite, دعوت کردن. In English, to invite someone to somewhere, the same format is used in Farsi. کسی را به جایی دعوت کردن. کسی is the direct object, and then جایی is the object of preposition because of the preposition به. So let's translate this sentence. I invited him to my house. من او را به خانه ام دعوت کردم. So sometimes students, they use or put the article ra after the object of preposition. So they say something like من او به خانه ام را دعوت کردم. But this is wrong because خانه ام is the object of preposition. It's not the direct object, and ra only needs to go with the direct object if it's specific. So remember, this is a very important point that you need to remember. Every time you are using a preposition, then you don't need to use ra after that. So just you need to be careful with where you put the article ra. The next point that you need to know is that when it comes to some verbs, the direct object naturally needs to have ra. Let's see what we mean here. For example, the verb to prefer, which in Farsi is ترجیح دادن. ترجیح, it means preference. دادن, it means to give. So to give preference, like the literal translation of it. So in English, to prefer something over something, in Farsi, we prefer something to something, which in English, you also use to as well. So for example, we have a sentence here. It says, I prefer pizza over salad. So pizza here, it has none of those triggers that we have learned in this lesson. It's just we're referring to general pizza, right? So it's not specific. But if you look at the translation, من pizza را به سالاد ترجیح میدهم. So you can see the article ra after the direct object pizza. And the reason is that because of the verb. So here we are preferring something over something. So that's why it's making the direct object a little bit more specific, even though we are just talking about pizza in general. But still, because we are preferring something over something, so it's making now the direct object specific. So it's going to trigger raw. This point is about remembering how to use the article raw. Based on my teaching experience, I realized that understanding the concept of the article raw, it's not hard for the students. What's hard for the students is remembering it. Understanding the concept of raw and using it properly, it's so important in the Persian grammar that even in the spoken informal language, you cannot get away with it. You need to use it if raw is required. One way that I can suggest you that might help you, at least in the beginning, is this one. So we have two verbs here, and I have taken these two pictures from my vocab list on Quizlet. So the first verb here is شروع کردن, which means to start. So instead of memorizing شروع کردن, memorizing just the verb, you can memorize it with the generic term used for the object, like چیزی را شروع کردن. And most of the times it will trigger را, because usually we start something specific, right? So you can memorize it like to start چیزی را شروع کردن. Or like this example, this is a prepositional verb. So نشان دادن, to show. Instead of memorizing just نشان دادن, you can memorize it with the چیزی and the preposition as well. So چیزی را به کسی نشان دادن. Once you memorize the verbs with their generic objects, then it would make it a lot easier for you guys to also use it properly. But overall, keep in mind using raw properly where you need to. It just takes time and practice, and it's not something that you can just like learn overnight. This point is about the order of the direct object and the object of preposition in Persian. So we have the sentence, he gave this apple to his teacher. او این سیب را به معلمش داد. So usually in proper grammar, the direct object comes before the object of preposition. But you need to know that this rule is not very strict. We can also change the order, and we can also say something like او به معلمش این سیب را داد. So we can also bring the object of preposition first and then the direct object. In English, the order is a little bit more strict, but in Farsi, it's not that strict. It's flexible, especially in the spoken language. It doesn't matter which order you use. So you can either say او این سیب را به معلمش داد, or you can say او به معلمش این سیب را داد. The next point is what if we have more than one direct object? Do we need to add a ra to each one? For example, I gave that pen, pencil, scissors, and tape to my friend. So we have more than one direct object. In this situation, we do not need to add a ra to each one individually. We can just list all the objects and then add a ra to the last object. So the sentence is من آن خودکار، مداد، قیچی و چسب را به دوستم دادم. So it is not necessary to add را after each one because they are all kind of somehow connected to each other by like the conjunction و or by like this coordinators here. So by adding ra to the last one, it would be enough. Next lesson is part 2 of the article ra, which is about attaching direct objects. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. If you found this lesson helpful, please don't forget to like this video and to subscribe to my channel. And also, if you have any questions, just let me know. If you like me to make a video about a specific topic, just please write it down in the comment section. So I will see you guys in another lesson. Khoda Hafiz.